one of the more tricky concepts when it comes to the spiritual life is this notion of actively trusting in the Lord. So when it comes to trusting in Christ, what do you do? What do you not do? If you think you're supposed to do something, what exactly is that something? Stuff like that. And so to illustrate the point, perhaps I might take the time right now to go over this really famous story told by the Lord called the parable of the sower, which you find in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 13, which is a really striking example of how the Gospels and the parables in particular can often be a lot more practical than you might expect. And so as you might recall, the story revolves around this sower, who obviously represents God, who is sowing all sorts of seed, representing his word, on all sorts of different terrain, including not just the good soil, but also the path, the thorns, and the rocky ground. And so the whole idea behind the gospel, in a certain sense, is to clarify that God is not some absentee landlord. Like, he's not someone who occasionally gets involved in human history every once in a while. Rather, he is always working. He is constantly active, constantly sowing the seeds of grace, constantly sowing the grace of conversion. So the question is not so much, will God ever get involved in my life? Because he's always living and active. Rather, the question is, do I tend to inhibit the receipt of God's grace? Again, the grace of conversion, by falling into these common pitfalls as represented by the seeds sown on the path, the thorns, and the rocky ground. And so the first image that the Lord talks about is this image of the path, which the Lord himself says represents the person who hears without understanding, such that the seed doesn't take root and eventually is snatched away by the evil one. And perhaps I must suggest that the real key to understanding this particular image of the path is to appreciate that back in the day, it used to be the rich soil. So back in the day, it had this real capacity to receive the seed and to bear much fruit. But since then, it's been trampled upon, beaten upon by things and perhaps even people, such that now it is completely one-dimensional, in the sense of being all surface and no depth. To illustrate the point, I remember once talking to a class at one of our local schools about the subject of video games. And I remember asking them the particular question: imagine you're playing video games for hours on end over the course of a particular day. How do you tend to feel at the end of that process? And initially, one of the kids said, awesome, which obviously wasn't the answer I was looking for. But eventually, the other kids kind of got it. So they said things like, well, if you're playing video games for hours on end over the course of a particular day, you tend to feel sluggish, you tend to feel tired, you tend to feel sad. And I think one kid even said, you tend to feel kind of stupid at the end of it. And that's what I was looking for. And so again, I wasn't giving them the answers, but they were saying, reflecting on their own experience, that when we play video games for hours on end, again, over the course of a particular day, we tend to feel sluggish, tired, stupid, and sad. So then I went on to ask them another question. So I said, okay, kids, imagine again, you're playing video games for hours on end over the course of a particular day. What's the last thing you want to have someone say to you? And the initial response, I think it was from the same kid who spoke first the last time, was die. Like, the last thing you want to happen to you when you're playing video games for hours on end is to basically die on, say, level 5, 6, or 10. Now, I have to admit that that answer was actually pretty funny, so I had to give him credit for that. But again, it wasn't the answer I was looking for. So I pressed the kids until eventually one of them gave the right response. And I think it was a little girl, actually. So basically what she said was, again, if you're playing video games for hours on end over the course of a particular day, the last thing you want to have someone say to you is something like, can you help me? Which, of course, is the answer I was looking for. And the whole point of the exercise, in a certain sense, was to demonstrate that playing video games for hours on end tends to habituate you to turning inwards. It tends to make you selfish, right? Such that, again, the last thing you want to have someone say to you over the course of playing video games is some variation of, can you help me? Because even though it sounds weird, it's interfering with your petty ambition in the moment of moving from level 5 to level 6. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying playing video games is inherently bad, but at the same time, you gotta be mindful of how things affect you. So when it comes to cooperating with the spiritual life, clearly there are certain activities which tend to facilitate the work of the Spirit, like going to bed on time, doing spiritual reading, spending hours before the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. At the same time, there are other activities which tend to inhibit the work of the Spirit, like binge watching on TV, like playing video games for hours on end, like holding on to bitterness and resentment, like engaging in malicious gossip. And so even if I don't completely eliminate these things from my life, I gotta be mindful of the fact that these things tend to eat away from my delicate sense of interior peace and contemplation, such that many times I have nothing left for the things of God. Okay, so that's the image of the path. The second image is that of the rocky ground, which the Lord describes as one who hears the word and receives it, but then falls away because basically times get tough. And so this represents a person who has basically superficial faith, in a sense of a faith that is built around religious experience and emotional highs, which ultimately has no root when trials and tribulations come their way. And so the example that comes to mind, I remember talking to my spiritual director after I applied to the seminary, but before I got in, about this whole idea of the dark night of the soul, as you hear about, for example, in the writings of St. John of the Cross. And I remember asking him, Father, I hear that when people enter the seminary, over the course of their years in formation, they go through some variation of the dark night of the soul, this painful, confusing, and purifying experience that God permits in His providence, but which again is subjectively uncomfortable. Is that true? And I remember him looking at me and saying some variation of, I wouldn't worry about it, which meant that it was probably going to happen. So I remember freaking out at the time. And over the course of my 6 years in formation, it did happen, which I don't think is an exclusive experience. I think a lot of seminarians go through some variation of the dark night of the soul for good reason, right? But you see, the thing I want to impress upon you is that these moments of confusion and darkness and spiritual purification, which the Lord permitted in His divine providence during my time in seminary formation, were perhaps some of the most valuable experiences that I would have over the course of my time at St. Augustine Seminary. Because basically what I was coming to learn over the course of all these different experiences was this principle, as articulated by one spiritual writer, as knowledge plus suffering equals wisdom. Knowledge plus suffering equals wisdom. And not wisdom in the sense of being able to say clever things at cocktail parties, right? But wisdom in the sense of knowing what's important, knowing what is essential, and knowing, therefore, how to make appropriate decisions in the course of the messiness of ordinary life. Okay, so that brings us to our final image, this image of the thorns, which the Lord says represents this person who receives the word, but then allows worldly cares and the concern for riches to choke the thing such that it eventually bears no fruit. Now, in a certain sense, the key to understanding this image is to appreciate that when the Lord says riches, He doesn't simply mean wealth or money, but rather anything that we deem to be more valuable than God. And so again, anything that we deem to be more valuable than God. And so the whole idea is that, especially when it comes to people of goodwill, a temptation that the devil will often use with great success is not to tempt people to do overt forms of evil, like punching someone in the face or robbing a bank, but rather to give their hearts and to give their time and energy to the lesser good over and over again, such that eventually they have nothing left for the things of God. And so the example that comes to mind, I remember years ago going to confession to a good priest friend of mine before I entered the seminary. And it must have been the way I was confessing, but basically what he said to me was, early on in a spiritual life, it seems like the decision is between doing good and evil things. Like you have a certain decision point that's presented to you and you think, okay, should I do the good or the evil? And you hum and haw for a bit and you say, well, I guess I'll do the good, right? But he said, eventually as you develop maturity in the spiritual life, you realize that the choice is actually between competing goods. Should I do this good or that good? Should I do the lesser good or the greater good? So the whole idea is that if I want to develop perfect maturity and perfect love in the spiritual life, I need to learn to say no to all sorts of competing goods to preserve my heart and my strength and my energy and my time for those few things the Lord wants me to do carefully and well, to attain to the perfect good, if you will. In other words, as you grow in the spiritual life, you got to be constantly mindful of kind of guarding your heart, if you will, to not allow yourself, again, to be so caught up in the affairs of this world that you suddenly find you have nothing left for the things of God. Okay, now obviously we can go on, but the thing I want to impress upon you is that when we talk about these different ways in which we tend to inhibit the work of the Spirit, or inhibit the receipt of God's grace, the grace of salvation, again, is embodied by these different images of the path and the thorns and the rocky ground. If you think about it, the Lord is not asking all that much from us. Like, He really isn't. But at the same time, what He is asking of us is stuff which is very specific and very concrete. And so in a certain sense, what He's saying is like, look, guard your hearts. Don't worry. Don't be afraid. And don't give your precious time and energy to things that go nowhere. And again, that's it. That's all I expect of you. Hold that pattern. Stay in that space. And then trust and believe that eventually, in the scope of my divine providence, you will bear tremendous fruits, whether we're talking about 30, 60, or 100-fold. And may God bless you all.